Hi, I'm Emma Craig. I am a second year costume technology student. I am from Vancouver, Washington. So I made Rhoda the Rhino, aka Goldie, and really my design was based off of making a companion for Buddy. So the design concept was in the same visual world as him and in the same kind of scale as him. So that inspired a lot of the choices I made in choosing a Rhino, first off, because they felt compatible, and the way I simplified the elements that were like the features so that they matched Buddy's simplistic, like cartoonish design. So that was kind of how I approached my design for Goldie. My sculpt, I drew my picture to scale. So I drew it to the size I actually wanted the mask to be. And then I used that to scale my sculpt to a 25% size of that. So I was able to look at my drawing and take measurements and then make sure that my sculpt was 1/4 of all of those measurements. So it made it pretty easy for me at that point to do all of the math and okay, my sculpt's 1/4 the size. So I make my pattern pieces, I blow it up, and I can know exactly what to blow it up to. Somehow, I still managed to make my ears too big on my sculpt. So I blew them up and they were twice as large as I wanted them to be. So the sculpt was a little bit off, but I was able to scale my pattern down to be able to adapt it that way. But the ears were definitely a challenge in visualizing their presence on a smaller scale and then to the large scale. I think the hardest part for me was actually dyeing the fabric and using the covering I used for the skin, because I had to hand sew it together and then carefully fluff all of the seams so that you didn't see stitch lines at every curve. It was also tricky to decide which color her skin was going to be because we didn't want her to be too gray or purpley because that's what color Buddy was. So we wanted them to be distinctly different characters. And so that made it hard to be like, well, what color is a rhino then? So we ended up deciding that, well, rhinos are dusty a lot of the time. So we chose what color she was based on what their skin looked like when it was covered in dust. And it was kind of a pinkish, like gray, like beigey color. But getting that color right and then also like disguising the seams was definitely the hardest part. So the EVA foam, it is barged together, and something that's really tricky that's hard to visualize is you have to think about how those pieces of foam come together and what angle you cut the juncture at. Because if they're cut at a 90 degree and you put them together and they bend, they're going to curve, which if that's what you want, that's amazing. But if you want it to be an actual corner, you have to cut them at an angle so that they match and create the angle that you're looking for. So that was really tricky here because I have a jaw piece that I wanted to be an actual angle that cuts in so it's a defined piece, and then like the bottom jaw sitting back, I wanted that to be an angle so it came forward. But then I also had these curved places like around the back of the head and up the snout. So that was really tricky to test which pieces on which sides of the pieces had to be cut at that angle to get them to match the way I wanted them to and to behave as they all came together the way I wanted them to. It was also really tricky as you're making your pattern pieces to decide where they should break. And you would sometimes, I found that I broke some of them in places that were unnecessary. So I ended up having to glue a lot more than I needed to. And then other times I found, oh, I actually need to cut this and I need to angle it and I need to glue them together separately. So I ended up deleting, like combining pattern pieces in some areas and separating pattern pieces in other areas in ways that I didn't anticipate. So that part of the process was kind of a trial and error, which felt frustrating at the time because I did all this work of sculpting and creating a pattern and thinking that I trued it and got it all ready. And then you get it in foam and you're like, oh, these pattern pieces do not behave the same when they're 1/2 inch thick. So that was a real challenge for me, is to get all of those angles and planes curving the way that I really wanted them to. The finishings for my piece, for my mask, Goldie, I actually had a really good time with them. I had some ideas of how things were going to go, And then I got into the process and those didn't work out and I had whole new ideas. So I originally intended to just on the horns coat them with a plastic dip, and then I could use acrylic paint to paint them white. The plastic dip has to be at a really specific temperature for it to work well, and I tried coating them several times and there was all of these bubbles on them and they looked like, oh, she's covered in warts, and like, it was just not a good look. So I actually ended up scrapping that idea and taking spandex that was like a matte color and making sleeves to pull over, and I glued them down and then painted into those like shadows so that I would get the like texture on the horns that I wanted, but I actually ended up covering them with fabric like I did the rest of her head. The ears also, the foam itself is like one piece that curves around and then is glued straight to the head. And so it's a really smooth transition of just like ear, head on the bottom. But on rhinos, when you see there's like skin folds and all of these little tucks on their ears, and I had no idea how I was going to do that. I just knew I needed to figure it out. And I originally thought, well, I'll cover the ears smooth and then piece something around and see what happens. So I covered the ears smooth and I put them on the head to see how they looked on the scale. And the seam allowance I had at the bottom actually just naturally folded up and created the folds that I was looking for. So it was a really happy accident that they just did exactly what I wanted them to do. And I was like, wow, that never happens. Amazing. And the final thing was I was really excited about her eyelashes because she's very flirty, obviously. That's why Buddy loves her. And I had these ostrich feathers that were really dense and thick and black. And so I was able to use those and create these very fluttery eyelashes that the slightest movement will move with her eyes and reflect the gold. And I trimmed them so that they're narrower in the front and longer in the back. And they were just really satisfying when they were finally in, to be like, oh, look how cute she is. So you can see her eyelashes are fluttery here. And her eyes are actually half of a Christmas ball that's painted from the inside. So I started with the pupil and then the iris and then the white of the eye. So that was all painted in layers so that you could really see all of the details. And then the horns, they're seamed here, so it's as discreet as possible for the latex, and then they were painted with acrylic paint. And that actually helped to hold them onto the foam so they stay in place the way that they're supposed to. And I was actually able to do a cross cut on the fabric here and then just create this outer fold and able to wrap them with one other fold to create these little skin folds around the horn. And then her nostrils are actually just cut in to the foam, and then the fabric ends at the edge there. And then as you can see, her ear here has the nice fold there, and then it is cut and sewn into this bottom here. And then they are sewn all the way around the edge to create this little point here that they have. And then the final touch, you can see some shading and some rosiness on her cheeks. So I actually use a technique that they use in the Muppets, and to shade all of the Muppets on the felt that they use chalk pastels, because you can like brush them off and you can change them if you want, and they aren't permanent, but they create nice shadows and things around. So I was able to create some dimension and some shading in areas under her jaw, along the horns and the ears, and then inside it's shaded as well. So that really helped to give her some dimension. So that's Goldie.